Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each week on Turning of the Wheel podcast. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And today we're going to be delving into the topic of Hellenistic astrology. Interesting subject. I've got Chris Brennan on the other line. He's just published a new book called Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune. It's out now. You can get it at Amazon. His website is chrisbrennanastrologer.com. One long string of words, chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Before we get him on, I want to just remind you about my weekly newsletter, which goes out every Sunday afternoon about 1:30, and in that you'll see 2 or so paragraphs on the mundane movements of the planets that are happening in the week to come, and then I break it out into the individual signs for the remainder of the week. And I always encourage you to read your sun sign and your rising sign. And if you don't know your rising sign, contact me or an astrologer such as Chris or anybody to get that information, and you'll be good to go. So as I've been watching Chris on Facebook for quite some time. I know he has a new book out. It's called, as I mentioned, Hellenistic Astrology, the Study of Fate and Fortune. So it's great to have you on today, Chris. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's good to be back.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you the question, why Hellenistic astrology versus another kind? Is this sort of a certain area of fascination for you, or do you find it to be more accurate or more in keeping with the philosophy and attributes of astrology?
Sure. So, I actually didn't want to study Hellenistic astrology at first, and I had kind of an aversion to it. My background was originally in modern Western psychological astrology, and I went to Kepler College in order to study that, basically 4 or 5 years into my studies, fresh out of high school. But when I got about 2 years into the program, at the point at which I was supposed to be able to branch off into individual studies and I was going to focus on or specialize in psychological astrology, they said, you have to take this course first, which is an introduction to something called Hellenistic and Vedic astrology. And I protested, and I said, no, that's old and outdated, and there's no relevance. They don't even use outer planets at that point 2,000 years ago. So what would be the relevance of that to me today? But they said, tough luck. You've got to take the course. And I took it. And yeah, and luckily, in my infinite wisdom as a 19-year-old or something at the time, I was mistaken on that one, much to my surprise. And I found that there was something valuable in studying the older traditions of astrology, because not only does it show you where many of the techniques that astrologers still use today came from and what their original conceptual and theoretical motivation was for why certain things mean what they mean, but also that there were techniques that were lost in the transmission of astrology over the past 2,000 years that we're just recovering now, which integrate right into techniques we already use and enhance them in ways that can make astrology better today.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. In some ways, sometimes the oldest is often the best. And I think looking out at the world of modern astrology today, oftentimes, I believe that there's more information than is necessary. That's not to say that it's not useful information. It's just that I feel that there's so much information out there that you can get lost in a morass of information and therefore cloud the reading or cloud the clarity of the individual. Whereas sometimes the simpler, more sort of generic foundational techniques actually are still just as accurate today as they were years ago.
Yeah, there's something to be said. Large part of 20th century astrology was about innovation and exploration and finding new things and incorporating new planetary bodies and new objects and asteroids and new aspects and all sorts of things like that, so that a new planet or a new asteroid or something's discovered every few years, or a new minor planet, and astrologers are very quick to write a book about it or what have you. But sometimes there's something to be said for really looking at the core things that we've had for a long time, like the 7 visible planets that are visible to the naked eye, and that there's a lot of meaning and nuance and usefulness that can be squeezed out of those things that are often overlooked when we sort of rush to incorporate new things rather than really solidifying and doing better to use the things that we already have.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I often find myself staying with the basic 7 planets. I think there's a wealth of information that you can derive from that. And I think it's a question of how you build the stories and you find the stories in the alignments of the planets that really make it rich. I do like Uranus, I like Neptune, I like Pluto, nothing against those planets, but I find that there's so much richness that you can get out of all the planets out to Saturn and the way they aspect each other, that is enough to create a very solid foundational astrological reading, I think, don't you?
Yeah, and I used Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as well. I just took a few years to really focus on refining just using the inner planets, because sometimes there's a lot more that you can get out of them than you would think, even though the outer planets are clearly very, very useful and very powerful.
They are useful and they are powerful, and they do help to explain certain facets, and I think they are as part of our contemporary sort of astrological lexicon, which is fine. But I do find that, the richness of what we can get out of the basic 7, and I think there's so many stories that are there, so many multi-layers of information that's there, that it really is enough. And I think that there's something about being within our range of view that makes it more tangible and more real, I think, to me, in my mind at least.
Yeah, I mean, especially in most forms of divination, there's a big difference about what can be seen from the perspective of the observer. And to the extent that the visible or the 7 traditional planets, including the sun and moon, can be seen with the naked eye if you just walk outside one night, like, on any given night, and see some planets out there that look like little stars that will move against the backdrop of the other stars over the course of successive nights. That's a big difference from an interpretive and a symbolic standpoint, the fact that you can see them versus that you can't see any planets out past Saturn. And I think sometimes that's sort of overlooked as an interpretive distinction that's kind of important.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And of course, then, when we go back in history and if we start incorporating the use of the outer planets as touchstones, technical points before they were even discovered, that becomes a little bit kind of sketchy as well, I think, in some ways. I mean, it leads to the seeds of doubt, because if the planet wasn't there or wasn't discovered yet, is it up for influence? I mean, does it have an influence that still is valid? In other words, if we look back to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, for example, and we didn't know about Pluto then, do we incorporate Pluto in our reading of a time like that, in that backwards glance?
Right. Yeah.
It seems kind of odd in that regard. But I think that, the planets, as you mentioned, going out to Saturn, they represent to me the most valuable components of the human, as you mentioned, the psychology of the individual. And although I do represent, I like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto more for sort of the generational aspects that they provide, sort of the foundation they provide for larger bodies of people and how they influence whole masses of people. I think they're more germane in that regard.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me, and that's a good way of sort of looking at it from a broader societal standpoint.
Yeah, and then the Hellenistic astrology really is sort of the basic primary foundation of almost all modern astrology. I mean, that is really the core of astrology. It's basically like going back and learning Latin or something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, essentially the fourfold system that is essentially the core of Western astrology today, which consists of, astrological charts that contain planets, signs of the zodiac, houses, and aspects. That fourfold system originated in the 1st century BCE in Egypt, which was under the control of Greek-speaking rulers at the time. So this is around the time that the Roman Empire is just getting going. And this fourfold system of interpreting charts, especially birth charts with those 4 techniques, planets, signs, houses, aspects, kind of explodes and comes out of nowhere in the 1st century. And suddenly everybody's using it. And it's this very complicated, complex system that's being used in order to study an individual's fate or an individual's future. And just the idea, most modern astrologers don't realize that this system that we still use today originated at a specific point approximately 2,000 years ago in the Mediterranean. And there's something kind of interesting about that from a historical and a practical standpoint.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially given the roots of where they were, going back as far as the ancient Greeks and their methodology, of course. And then you have the whole tie-in with mythology and how it all sort of blends in so easily and nicely. There, it's really a fascinating system. I'm wondering what your opinion is. Do you think that sort of modern astrologers have gone too far in their exploration of the asteroids and these other extraterrestrial, for lack of a better word, components? Do you think that they have muddied the water in some way?
I mean, I think that whole process was necessary that happened in the 20th century to break away from and kind of ignore the roots of astrology in some sense and instead tread, new paths as some of these new avenues of astrological interpretation were opening up, and that was a healthy and useful thing. But I do think that at this point, part of the revival of interest in traditional astrology over the past 20 or 30 years has been a counter trend, which will potentially balance that out or balance out some of the excesses of, that tendency that sometimes occurs in some of those forms of modern astrology where, you can incorporate hundreds or thousands of bodies, or sometimes even hypothetical bodies, celestial bodies, into an astrological chart. And at some point, there are sort of like diminishing returns. It's not a situation where the more and more you add, the more and more detailed and the more accurate you get. But instead, in some instances, it does seem like it does, as you said, kind of muddy the waters, or it has the potential to. So the counter trend is to, balance that out by having a system where sometimes you can use just the 7 visible bodies, which is kind of like bare bones from a modern perspective from looking at a chart, but still be able to squeeze a surprising amount of information out of that. And so I don't know in the end that that's where it's going to stay. I think it's just kind of like a counter trend to pull it back in the other direction. But ultimately, we'll probably as a community settle somewhere in between the two extremes eventually.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. It's kind of like making pizza dough. There's just some certain basic ingredients you need. You don't need to have extra things in there to complicate the mix. Sometimes the basic and most simple forms, and not that astrology is simple by any stretch of the imagination, but sometimes the most simple and pragmatic approach is the best. And I think that when we look at the characteristics of the human individual, what we see in an astrological profile, so much information can be derived there. I think that we do clients a disservice by dragging in a lot of extraneous things, and there's a lot of talk about that. And you see it in the chat rooms and everything else, or on the social media, all of the odd characteristics that come in. I think that it do a disservice in some way because, in many ways, they complicate the experience for the client. I think more than anything else, because they're trying to get their heads around a very complicated subject as it is. Then when we complicate it further by adding odd planets here and there, it can become overwhelming for them.
Yeah, I mean, different people have different levels of success with that. And I've seen some people, Demetra George does a relatively good job of finding a way to use the things that are relevant to the native and not try to throw too much extraneous information in. But then on the other hand, sometimes you do see some stuff that's a little bit more out there that seems like it's just throwing the everything in the kitchen sink, into the delineation. And I'm not sure if that results in as much precision as one might hope.
No, that's why I think it, as a matter of fact, I think it does just the opposite. I think it scatters the reading too far, dilutes it in some way because there's just way too much information. I think the more basic, and I think astrologers would do well to spend more time drilling into the characteristics that they see in the basic 7-planet chart. I think that there's more to be derived there that can be useful and successful with regard to the individual. When you do an astrology chart for yourself or for a client, do you approach it from the standpoint of a psychologist? In other words, looking at this as this sort of glimpse of the individual, of the person, and sort of what their attributes and liabilities are, and then how to best manifest that going forward? Is that an accurate description of what you're sort of trying to achieve?
I mean, from a Hellenistic perspective, one of the things that they were really focused on was determining an individual's fate, and that included psychological and character descriptions of the native, which are sometimes like prescriptive in terms of giving them advice about how to act or how to counteract or counterbalance, certain tendencies they might have that might not be healthy or might be problematic for their overall health and well-being. But it was also more broadly about, with some of the more advanced timing techniques, which take the entire life and break it up into different chapters and subsections as if the life was a book and you could read the narrative of the native's life. In that sense, you're sort of giving them a glimpse into the future in order to give them a heads up about some of the things that are coming.
Right.
And some of that's, positive or helpful things. Other things might be more challenging or difficult. But a large part of the sort of repeated rationale for astrology among a bunch of the Hellenistic astrologers was just that it prepares you for events in the future as though they're in the present, so that you can prepare yourself to accept all events that happen with a greater sense of meaning and purpose and tranquility.
I also think it gives the client an option to decide which way to go with what we provide them. I think that this is where fate and free will sort of butt up against each other. But I think that we know that we have a tendency towards or proclivity towards something in our lives. We have something jumps out of the chart, say a person's meant to be a writer or whatever the situation may be. And we see that as astrologers, we're looking at those. And then we have the ability to say, this may be happening to you, but you have the ability to step into it and direct that energy in a direction that's more positive. I think that's one of the beauties of astrology, is sort of being forewarned allows us to be forearmed, where we can then make a conscious decision to take the energy of the time, even if it's a difficult, challenging aspect. That can also be incredibly empowering at the same time, I feel.
Yeah, definitely. Although by the same token, sometimes what's weird, I think, as an experience, sometimes as an astrologer, is seeing something coming, knowing or having a good idea of what it's going to be about and how you might like to change it or deal with it in a certain manner, sort of when it's a hypothetical thing at some point in the future. But then you get there and you're sort of in the thick of the moment, and you realize that there's like a thing that you're going to do or that you have to do, and that perhaps it's difficult or not pleasant, or it's going to be something you have to push through or persevere with, but that it's almost like something that you can't avoid or can't sort of sidestep or can't do as gracefully as you thought you could, but instead it's just something that you have to get through at the time or something that you have to do. I mean, seems like there's different, instead of talking about fate and free will as this sort of all or one type thing, sometimes there's different scenarios where you might have more of one or less of the other, so to speak. And sometimes that introduces a sort of wild card factor into the whole discussion.
It does, but I do feel like I think that does put the onus, or at least the responsibility, back on the individual to say, okay, I may be going through a financial difficulty at some point in time. How do I respond to that? And I think that having that knowledge, I think, is incredibly valuable. It's one of the greatest things about astrology. I think that we know they were entering into a themed period driven by an aspect or driven by a transit. And we say, okay, I'm entering into this themed period. What's the best way for me to respond to that? And I think money's a very good example. You can say, well, you're entering into a period where you're going to have some challenging aspects regarding money. Well, you might decide to start, spending less money, cutting some bills, paying down your credit card, wherever. There's positive ways, I think, for any thing that you can manifest. If you see a negative or a potentially libelous aspect coming up, or dangerous aspect, or potentially harmful or whatever, and you are able to sort of be forewarned, you can then act accordingly to sort of mitigate that by taking steps. I think that's one of the greatest things about astrology, is that ability to get that insight of what's happening and when it's coming.
Sure. And I mean, sometimes that, our ability to react, though, is simply our perception of things, or how we deal with it and how we take it internally in some sense. Whereas, sometimes one of the tricky things is dealing with events in our lives that are, completely outside of our control, because sometimes there are, things that happen in our environment, or the things that happen in other people's lives that, affect us in some way through our relationship with them, that, we don't have any control over, but
Right.
We do have some control over our our perception of it in some sense, or how we contextualize it in our own minds.
Right, exactly. And I think that's exactly what I was referring to. I was faced with a situation like this where I knew something very dire was happening to me, and I had to make a conscious decision as to how to approach that. And I approached it by taking a very positive attitude towards it, which I think was enabled me to get through it much more successfully, because I was able to shift my thinking. And it happened in what I would call a Uranian moment, because it was such a bolt out of the blue. I had this revelation that said that there's two ways of dealing with this problem. Not that all problems are black and white or two-pronged, but in this particular case, it was a black or white decision, and I made a decision to opt in a positive manner towards this decision as best I could. And it actually allowed me to get through a very difficult time, I think, with a much different approach, a different attitude, a different mindset, which really allowed me to change my whole experience with the situation. I think it was very helpful. I would not have known that had it not been for my knowledge of astrology and where I was going.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think of, now one of the questions that oftentimes I have had discussions with other astrologers about, and I'm curious what you think, when we do see what we think of may be a malefic situation or something that looks dire to the individual or has the potential for that, how do you deal with that ethically, as far as, you don't want to plant the seed in someone's mind that would then self-prophesize. So we want to have a guarded sense of being able to manipulate and use the right words. And manipulate is not the right word. Use the right words to gain the insight, or to plant the seed of caution without overblowing it or overstepping our bounds or creating havoc on the parts of the client.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly tricky, just because it also varies from client to client, where it's like sometimes you're talking with somebody and you realize, this person could really handle knowing whatever piece of information, or they're at a space where they're sort of ready for that, whereas you're talking to somebody else who might be in a more sort of fragile state of mind and might not be prepared to hear something that they don't want to hear.
Right.
So in a client perspective, that's difficult. I mean, honestly, even from an astrologer's perspective, that can be challenging, because I think sometimes even, astrologers in our own lives, sometimes we'll see something coming up that doesn't look like a very good transit, or looks like it could foreshadow a sort of challenging period. And sometimes knowing the full spectrum of different manifestations, or having seen the full spectrum of different manifestations, in client charts, from the extremely terrible to the very mildly annoying manifestations, sometimes that can be annoying, because sometimes you can either overestimate or underestimate how challenging some personal upcoming transit on your own is going to be. And obviously that's something that you get better at, and you sort of after successive times can grow and sort of incorporate. But it's interesting even that's not just a client issue, but sometimes it can be a personal issue for astrologers.
It certainly is. I've had my days where I've looked at my charts and said, oh my gosh, or whatever, and I know that feeling very well. It is kind of I do try to take an optimistic approach no matter where I am, though I try to find that silver lining. I always think of difficult aspects as being challenges, but I think we all grow through the challenges. They're necessary stepping stones. I mean, the squares, to me, I always refer to them as a staircase, where you're climbing up these 90-degree angles, which are ways of getting you to your destination. And I see them as metaphorical in that regard. And I like that metaphor, because I think that, it is a challenge to climb the stairs. You can look at it that way. You're climbing a ladder. You're moving forward. You're moving on with your life. You're making progress, all of which are good. And nothing worth having comes easily. So we do have to have a degree of challenge. I think that that's an important part of it. So in many ways, the squares are our greatest gifts in the chart in some cases, because they force us to do things that are right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, clearly necessary, especially when you're growing up in the early stages of life and going through successive things that are like hurdles or difficulties, or things that start out as things that seem impossible, but later become things that are just, second nature. It often comes only as a result of striving and challenge and difficulty.
Right. And you look back at your life and say, gosh, that was a difficult time, but I would not be where I am today had I not walked that walk.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really challenging thing in terms of, talking with clients, in terms of being careful about that, in terms of being it's such a delicate issue to talk about sometimes instances where people are dealing with real issues of tragedy or, extreme levels of hardship or trauma, and trying to reframe it in a positive and empowering way. But on the other hand, trying to be careful not to sort of almost trivialize it or paint it with too positive of a brush, since sometimes, people are dealing with just, tragic things that are. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to be cognizant of that and treat that with due respect and diplomacy and all that. And it can very well be a difficult a path to walk. There's no question about it. But I do find that overall that if people can use I always think of it like, when you're thinking about energy always possesses it's sort of like electricity. Always there's a positive and negative characteristic there. In each of those aspects, there is the potential for the energy or the time or the influence to propel us in a direction. And I think that it's important that we help guide that direction. I remember having this discussion with Robert Hand one time years ago. As I had a client who was there and kept saying to me, I don't like my chart. I don't like who I am. I don't like this. I don't think I want to be this. And, as if they could change the chart. If I could just be born 3 or 4 days later, I'd be better off. But the simple truth of the matter was, I said, we cannot change our charts. This is our DNA. This is our fingerprint. This is our, this is who we're supposed to be. But what we can't change who we are, but we can redirect ourselves in that regard. So there is the ability. I think we do have this ability, and I think this comes from a deeper knowledge of astrology, being able to use that difficult times, if that's the case, and put them in a positive way. I'm not trying to sugarcoat everything here. I know there's plenty of tragedy, and people always come to see astrologers when they are in hard times or trying to make decisions. They don't rarely come to us when they're happy. But it seems as if that if we can get them to view theirs as a potential time for growth and expansion as a character building, then we've actually done our job well, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And then it puts it in a much more proactive and sort of useful category of sort of helping or healing rather than just, prognosticating or a prediction or what have you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're talking today with Chris Brennan. He is the author of Hellenistic Astrology, the study of fate and fortune. It's out. It's a new book. It's out. You can get it on Amazon, or you can get it at HellenisticaStrology.com. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to delve into the book a little more and continue our conversation. So hang in there. In the meantime, check out Chris's website, ChrisBrennanAstrologer.com or HellenisticaStrology.com. And also, he has the astrologypodcast.com. So he's up there with me as well. So we'll be back in a few minutes, and we'll continue our conversation. What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today, or call me at 978-393-1036. That's 978-393-1036. www.chrisflisher.com.
Astrology is the science of spirit, and it can serve as an invaluable aid in making the difficult choices in life and seeking truth in all the directions we choose. It holds the potential to allow each of us to evolve to our highest potential. It is the logic of the universe, the code of existence, and the pathway to true wisdom. It is our duty to draw from it the instructions for our lives and to live them to our fullest potential. As the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.turningofthewheel.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. And enter a world of possibility and color. Okay, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. We're talking today, as I mentioned, with Chris Brennan. His website is chrisbrennanastrologer.com. And he has just completed his new book, which is called Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. And it's a fascinating book. It's one of these things. Now, it's a topic that's been written about in the past, Chris. How did you decide to delve into this, and is your approach to it different than others?
Sure. So, when I got into Hellenistic astrology in 2005, one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of translations had been produced in the 1990s by different people, which were translations of these ancient Greek and Roman astrological texts, but there weren't a lot of good introductory books which really gave a full comprehensive overview of everything that had been found in those translations, but also that gave you sort of an introduction to the whole subject in general. Because one of the things that I realized is that even though a lot of people had bought those translations and supported different translation movements in the 1990s, a lot of those translations ended up sitting on different astrologers' bookshelves and never getting used because even though they were translated into English, they were still incredibly difficult to read and understand the techniques that were contained in them. So what I realized about 10 years ago is that somebody needed to translate the translators essentially and write a book, sort of introducing people to this subject and providing an overview of the different sources that exist, and then giving a demonstration through chart examples and through client files of some of the different techniques that have been recovered so far to really demonstrate not just why you would want to study this material, but how it can actually be used successfully and effectively in modern practice.
Yeah. And, the thing is that because it is an ancient language, as written in an ancient language, you've sort of brought it into the contemporary world. And I think that's a valuable step because it brings it into more of our language has changed, our nuances changed. We've got words now that they probably didn't even have back then that allow us to express things differently. And our whole view, and of course, astrology has evolved simply by virtue of the nature of more empirical data. So we have more data now that supports the logic of it, which means that astrology is going to become more accurate as time goes on.
Yeah, definitely. And our ability to calculate charts and the accuracy of our chart calculations and everything else, when you take some of those older techniques and then apply them within a modern context where we've got even greater technological capabilities, it really creates a nice combination.
Yeah. Were you challenged in trying to find the research for this? Is this difficult information to find? I know there's a lot of work out there about astrology and stuff like that, but did you require you to go and dig into libraries to try to find out some of this information?
Yeah, I had to amass a large library of different texts. There was a lot of sometimes photocopying. A lot of these texts are only contained in Greek and Latin, or they haven't been translated yet. And so I'd have to work my way through. One of the things that I did, for example, is there's a chapter that survives from the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, where he gives all the significations of the planets, and it's in ancient Greek. So I actually went through with a ancient Greek dictionary and tried to retranslate that for a chapter of the book. And each time I would have to look up, the Greek word and try and find out what it meant. But then one of the things I ran into is that there were different interpretations, or some words would mean multiple things. And sometimes the astrologer would use like a euphemism for something. So you'd have to study ancient, uses of euphemisms and things like that. And yeah, it was kind of challenging just because there was a lot of different sources and a lot of it's contained in old texts that you need some advanced, training to read.
Yeah, gosh, I can imagine. It must have been very, I think you'd have to, if you had a Greek dictionary and you're reading ancient Greek, you would need to translate almost every word. I suppose there's a time when you got to recognize some words, but we're dealing with a different language on top of a different language. I mean, you're dealing with the astrology language as well as dealing with the Greek language, and having to, sort of mitigate that chasm must have been very difficult.
Yeah, and one of the things that's funny is sometimes it's even worse. Like, for example, my friend Benjamin Dykes recently did a translation of a first century text that he published by an astrologer named Dorotheus of Sidon. And this text is one of the oldest surviving texts on both natal astrology and electional astrology from the first century. But the text itself, it doesn't survive in its original language, but instead what we have is an English translation of an Arabic translation that was based on a Persian translation of the original Greek text, which was originally written in the form of a poem.
Gosh.
So with that text, you've literally got a text that's 3 or 4 times removed from its original language that you then have to study and try to understand, what the techniques are that this person's talking about.
Yeah, lots of room for misinterpretation, I'd imagine, and our second guessing, I guess, is probably a better word. You're trying to discern which way you'd go with something like that. When you look at the ancient astrology, or what you discovered while you were reading these texts and books that old, do you find that they hold up as foundational pieces of astrology as they work in the contemporary world? Do they hold up in that regard? I mean, obviously they're talking about different seasons. They're talking about different. Their whole context was different. When you bring that ancient context and bring it into the world of say 2017. Do those basic psychological profiles hold up?
Yeah, I mean, it's mixed. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, the culture is very different, and sometimes there'll be different rules because the concerns of like clients in the first century was a little bit in the culture was a little bit different. So, for example, in Dorotheus's work on electional astrology, there's a very brief chapter where it gives some rules, and it says, if a client comes to you and their slave has run away, cast a chart for when the slave ran away, and this will tell you if the slave will return and come back. So on the one hand, yes, it's very different, or it can be very different. On the other hand, there's other chapters that are more humorous, and it's like there's one chapter in electional astrology in the same work where it says, and the chapter title is very long, and it says, this is the chapter on if you get in a fight with your spouse and your spouse leaves you and you cast a chart for when the spouse leaves to see if your spouse will come back. And it's interesting because it's actually applying similar rules from the previous example. But so on the one hand, things are very different in some areas, but for the most part, I would say 70 to 80, maybe even higher, maybe 85, 90% of the time, most of life back then, 2,000 years ago, is still surprisingly similar to the way that it is today, or at least the fundamental areas of life. And that's why you can have a system that was invented 2,000 years ago where, the 12 houses were supposed to show most of the fundamental areas of life. And that concept and all of the basic significations of the 12 houses were introduced in 2 or 3 different texts around the 1st century BCE. And all of those areas are still relevant today. So you have the first house and like character as well as body and physical vitality. You have the second house in a person's personal finances. Mm-hmm. You have the third house in siblings and travel, the 4th house in parents, the 5th house in children, the 6th house in illness or health, 7th house is spouse, 8th house is death, 9th house is travel, religion, foreigners, 10th house is career, 11th house is friends, and 12th house is enemies and loss. There's some modifications of that, but for the most part, those are still largely the same significations that many astrologers ascribe to those houses today. And that's from 2,000 years ago, because those areas of life are still with us today and are still essentially the same as they were 2,000 years ago, because people deal with the same fundamental things in life, essentially.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And as human beings, our emotions and our interreactions with each other and our complications of our lives are all the same as they always were. And it supports completely the idea of time as a helios, because things go around and around and around. They just go down the road further, different place in time. And I'm sure that 200 years from now, the situation, if we're still on this planet and still swirling around the sun, the situation will be the same there too. And we can see that even in literature as well. You look back at at the famous literature, the stories are still the same. They're the same stories that were told in mythology. They're still the boy meets girl, girl meets boy, and the same jealousies and backtrails and betrayals are still happening today as they were in the time back then. So it's very accurate. It's really amazing.
Yeah, so it's not so much about things being so different. It's more about looking back and finding techniques that they used that we either there are techniques that we still use, but that they did certain things in order to enhance those techniques, in order to use them a little bit more effectively, that we lost. Because one of the things you have to think about is, if we've been using the same system for 2,000 years, except what happened is that different cultures and different empires would rise and fall, and astrology would get passed on through translations every few hundred years, where the system would be translated from one language to another. But each time it was transmitted, it changed in some way. Mm-hmm. And some things were lost and other things were added, because it was basically like a 2,000-year-long game of telephone or whatever you call it.
Exactly.
Where people get in a circle and then one person whispers a secret into one person's ear and then they pass it on to the next person. And by the time it comes all the way around the circle, oftentimes the message is much different than when it started. So a lot of what this is about is just skipping through the past 2,000 years of that transmission of one person passing it to another and going back to see what the original system of Western astrology was like.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking of telephone and I thought, well, they didn't have telephones in 2000, back then, but it is the accurate analogy to make. Do you have a particular technique that you like, that you are more fond of using, or sort of your default technique?
Yeah, I mean, there's two techniques. One of them is sect, which is the distinction between day and night charts, and the other is called zodiacal releasing, which is a advanced timing technique that I use with all of my clients at this point to divide the entire life up into chapters and subsections.
Interesting. I'm curious about the zodiac releasing. How does that work?
So it's actually based on the lot of fortune,
Mm-hmm.
Which is called a part of fortune, usually in modern times, and another part which is the opposite of fortune, which is called the lot of spirit. And so that's actually what things like the lot of fortune were originally used for 2,000 years ago, is they were the starting points in a system of complex timing techniques. So you would start from the lot of fortune if you wanted to study matters pertaining to the native's health. And you would start from the lot of spirit if you wanted to study their career and overall life direction. And whatever sign of the zodiac the lot of spirit falls in, it activates that sign for a certain number of years based on whatever planet rules that sign. So, for example, if it falls in Scorpio, it will last for 15 years, and that'll be the first chapter of the native's life. Or if it falls in Aquarius, then that means that the first chapter of the native's life will last for 30 years. So there's different years associated with each of the signs of the zodiac, and the first chapter of your life lasts for however many years are associated with that sign. Once that first chapter of life is over, once the number of years expires, it then moves to the next sign in zodiacal order after that in counterclockwise motion, which is the motion of the planets through the signs. And then that sign becomes activated for a certain number of years, such as 12 years if it's Sagittarius, or 8 years if it's Libra, and just keeps moving through the signs in zodiacal order like that at this variable rate.
And you think that's more accurate than, say, tracing Jupiter through your life or following Saturn, that's just an adjunct to that reading?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, transits are still very useful, and studying like Saturn's cycle, the 30-year Saturn cycle, or looking at broader things like Uranus oppositions, mm-hmm. or the Neptune square, what have you, is still very powerful and very useful. But this technique for actually studying specific topics and narrowing it down to, like, let's say, career and life direction, one of the weird things that it's capable of doing is identifying when a person will reach a more active and important or pivotal period in terms of their overall career and life direction. And usually those periods will coincide with career peaks. Mm-hmm. So I've never found a technique that's been that specific in being able to identify the high points in a person's career, or the points where the person will do some of their most important work, or in some instances will actually find what their life's work is. its ability to do that was kind of a lot different than anything I'd ever seen before.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I've always thought, I mean, I think people arrive at different parts of their lives at different times. I always use the analogy of a cuckoo clock, where we have all these different size wheels spinning around inside. And then there comes a point in time when the wheels all click and the cuckoo comes out. I think that's sort of an analogy that's simplified for perhaps many people, but at least it does give you the idea that the timing and the aspects do line up in a way that is important for you to determine which way to go. And it's very useful, I think, for career planning. You know, I've always thought that what an astrologer could do in a high school counseling situation would be phenomenal. I think, as far as people trying to decide which way to go and how to go. I've had clients who've come to me that have made definitely the wrong choice in their lives, but they were also pushed by family members or whatever. And then when they finally found their true calling and they opted for that, their life changed dramatically. They were not forced by outside influences. People oftentimes, you know, maybe not so much today, but I know that in the old days, people would tend to fall into the family business as the most logical place to be, when maybe that wasn't the right place for them after all, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And I like that idea of a cosmic clock, or astrology acting like a cosmic clock that you were talking about earlier, just because there are, like you said, it's fascinating to see, especially with this technique. You know, there are different people that hit career peaks at different points in their life, sometimes very late and sometimes very early, or sometimes right in the middle. But seeing it actually outlined in advance using this technique is really pretty striking. Like, one of my examples I use is Robert Downey Jr. It showed him going into a 20-year career peak starting in 2007 and 2008. And that's right when he filmed and then had the release of the first Iron Man movie. And then within a few years after that, became the highest paid actor in Hollywood. So he'd been, you know, in Hollywood for an actor for 20 years at that point, playing leading roles, but he sort of struggled and had many ups and downs for many years. And then suddenly this 20-year career peak kicks in according to this ancient timing technique, and suddenly he's become this wildly successful actor who's made this huge comeback. Versus another example I like to use, a really great example, is Justin Bieber, because the technique shows him hitting his major career peak in the first 25 years of his life. And of course, he famously was discovered on YouTube singing by his manager as a teenager in his early teens, and then very quickly had this sort of meteoric rise to stardom very early in life.
Yeah. I've always used Michael Jackson as an example, because I remember watching him when I was a kid on stage. He was 5 years old with his brothers, and he hit his peak at a point like that where they were very popular. And then I always use the other example of George Bernard Shaw, the English author, who didn't get his first book published until he was 94. So I think that sort of dovetails into the idea of the timing and that sequence of the clock, that's sort of the astrological cuckoo clock, for lack of a better term.
Right. Or other examples, like the Michael Jackson one is good because he had different points and different career peaks. Yeah. And sometimes you have people like that, like John Travolta, for example, who was like really big in the 70s and stuff with Grease, but then kind of his career went into a slump for a while during the 1980s into the early 1990s. And then all of a sudden he did Pulp Fiction and made this huge comeback. Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting thing as well, and being able to identify and try to find, you know, what is the specific signature for something like that, of somebody that has multiple career peaks or has one peak and then a slump and then a comeback, versus somebody, you know, that just has one major peak either very early in their life or very late in their life or what have you.
Yeah, and you tie that to the part of fortune and the part of spirit. A lot of spirit.
It's tied to the part of fortune and the part of spirit, because the part of spirit is associated with the mind and the intellect and choices that the native makes as a result of deliberate personal volition. So it's sort of like their free will in some sense, whereas the lot of fortune is the opposite. It's things that are outside of the native's control that happen in their circumstances and in their environment. And so with this technique, what's cool about it is that you use both of those lots, and you start from the lot of spirit to study career, but then you see when the timing technique, when it moves around the chart until it comes to the sign that contains the lot of fortune. And when it does that, suddenly there's this intersection between the native's free will and essentially the native's fate. And that's when they typically will have career peaks, because the things that they're attempting to put out into the world through deliberate choice, and the things that they're creating in the world suddenly fall into line with their circumstances, and the things that are available to them are outside of their control, and it sort of creates a perfect storm of being the right person who's in the right place at the right time, versus the other scenario where sometimes it's like you sometimes meet people who are very talented or very gifted, but they weren't in the right place at the right time, or they didn't meet the right people or have the right opportunities, and therefore they were never able to fully actualize that potential as well as they could have, perhaps, versus other people like, let's say Bill Gates, for example, who, famously went to school at one of the very early in life at a place that had a computer. And so he was able to get a jump start learning programming and learning software programming very early in life compared to other people in the world.
Mm. So that does have an element of free will involved, inherent in it, in the fabric of what you're talking about. Because if people know this, especially for younger people, like my example of the high school student, if you ran their chart and walked them through their their life path rather, you could easily point them in the right direction. And of course, that would be up to them to decide whether they wanted to go. That's where the free will would come in, right?
Yeah, I mean, they still have to actually do it and put in the effort and work, sometimes very hard towards something. But it just shows that sometimes there's different periods in a person's life where they're going to be more successful, or they're going to find that their external circumstances are more conducive to what they're trying to accomplish than others.
Yeah. When you look at your own life, were you able to delineate that you were going to be going to Kepler University when you were 19 out of high school? Did you see that as a viable road marker for you?
Yeah, I mean, I started a 12-year peak period within a month or something of when I started studying astrology. And then within that, one of the highest sort of mini career peaks within that was when I discovered Hellenistic astrology, and actually when I started studying this technique, zodiac releasing, from the text of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens. So I always like to joke that when you found a good technique, when the technique itself tells you that you found it.
Yeah, it's sort of self-fulfilling. I know, exactly. That's funny. I enjoy that. But you're kind of unusual in that regard, because I mean, to know that you wanted to do that at 19, and it's sort of, I mean, it was not considered to be, it still isn't considered to be the career of choice for many people. Obviously, you've been successful at it, but it is a bit of a leap to jump into that. Did your parents say, "Hey, why don't you go to study psychology instead? You might do better"?
Yeah, I mean, I think they saw how certain I was about, pursuing this, that I felt like I had actually found something that I wanted to pursue for the rest of my life, or that I wanted to dedicate my life towards studying, because it was so fascinating. And if even like 5% of astrology was true, even if only 5% of astrology was true, it would still be this amazing thing that most people aren't aware of, and that's just sort of on the outskirts of society in some sense, happening and being practiced and being used in this really mysterious and really amazing way. And I really recognized that very quickly, and recognized that that's where I wanted to go through with things. So they were supportive, and I was very lucky as a result of that.
Yeah. How were you introduced to astrology? Did you sort of just pick it up on your own? You must have had that moment where you're like, wow, this is amazing stuff.
I was reading some books on Nostradamus because it was about 1999 and the end of the millennium, and that was the thing to do.
Right, the Y2K thing.
Right. So I was reading books on Nostradamus, and they had some stuff about astrology in there, because some of his prophecies were supposedly dated using planetary positions. So it would say such and such event will happen when Mars is in Sagittarius and Saturn is in Capricorn and Jupiter is in Scorpio. And so I wanted to know, how do I find out when that's going to happen? And then I looked it up and found out that you can find planetary positions in this thing called an ephemeris. So I went to a local bookstore that happened to carry ephemerides in their astrology section. I picked up a copy of the ephemeris and started learning how to use it. And from there, I learned about the concept of natal astrology and started casting my chart on astro.com. And after that, I was hooked.
You're hooked. It doesn't take much. Once you get the hook, once you get bitten by the astrology bug, you have it for the rest of your life. It's kind of like a terminal condition.
Right.
One thing I want to talk about, you mentioned, I think, the ruler of the year. I'm curious to hear how that is derived.
Yeah, so that's another Time Lord technique, except this one was more widely used than zodiacal releasing. Just about every ancient author used this technique because part of the premise of the Time Lord techniques is that whereas in modern times, oftentimes when we go into timing and prediction, we'll go straight to using transits, or we'll look at the transits as one of our early or one of our first things. For them, transits were always the very last line of defense. It was the final thing that you looked at once you had applied all of the Time Lord systems in order to determine which planets in a person's chart were already activated versus which ones were not. So the premise underlying the Time Lord systems is that a transit will not manifest in an actual event or something important unless that planet is activated as a Time Lord. So one of the techniques that's used to determine that is called annual perfections. And what you do with it is you just start from the rising sign, or the sign that contains the ascendant, and whatever sign of the zodiac that is, the traditional ruler of that sign, the planetary ruler, becomes activated for that year of the native's life as the Time Lord for the year. Mm-hmm. So that means that it's activated in both its natal placement, so whatever it indicates in the natal chart will be awakened that year, but it's also activated in its transits, so that whatever that transiting planet does that year, or if there are any transits to that planet in the natal chart, then those transits are going to be especially prominent that year. So you start with a rising sign, and that sign's activated for the first year of the life. Once that year is up, once the native hits their first birthday, it moves to the next sign in zodiacal order, which is the sign just after the ascendant, downwards, closer to the second house. Right. Yeah. And then that sign and its ruler become activated as the Lord of the year. Once that year's up, it moves to the next sign, and so on and so forth. So it's just one sign per year and one planet being activated each year. And it's really cool because it explains why sometimes you'll have an important transit coming up and you'll think it's going to mean something really important, and then it comes and goes and nothing much happens, versus other times, there'll be this little minor transit that you didn't think was going to be a big deal, and then it hits and it coincides with some major event. The major missing piece that explains why that happens sometimes to astrologers is this technique, annual perfections, because it can tell you which transits are going to be activated in a given year.
And this is unique for each individual, right? Can it be applied in a mundane fashion as well?
Yeah, I mean, you could apply it to like electional charts or event charts, but it's usually used primarily, or at least I've focused on using it within the context of natal astrology. Yeah, and this is this technique is explained in the book, right? Yeah, I think it's like chapter 17 or 18 is all on annual perfections. And I think I used something like 20 or 30 example charts in order to show different, details surrounding the technique and how it actually works out in the charts of either clients or sometimes celebrity charts that I've picked out. At one point, I just sort of demonstrated how even just counting around, one sign per year, that whatever house is activated in that year, that the topics associated with that house will come more to the forefront oftentimes in the native's life. And I used 12 examples in order to show 12 different people who came to different perfection years where different houses were activated in their charts, and how that year really manifested the quality of that house. So there was like a person who hit the 7th house perfection year and they met their future spouse who they would be married to for the next 84 years, or a person who had a 10th house perfection year and suddenly hit a career peak, or a person who hit a 5th house perfection year and they had their first and only child, and so on and so forth.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's fascinating. Really interesting stuff. We're out of time, as I knew we would be. The time flew. My guest today has been Chris Brennan. He is the author of his new book is Hellenistic Astrology, the study of fate and fortune. Don't be put off by the word Hellenistic. It's an old and ancient, and sometimes the old and ancient is the best these days, as we found out. It's a wonderful book, full of interesting ideas and quite a labor of love on your part. It's a huge book. You've done quite a bit of work on it. Must be feel great to have this great thing under your belt and done and out of the way. I'm sure it was probably a Saturnian moment breathing over your neck as you wrote this just to get it done. But it's quite a job for sure.
Yeah, it was a big project, but I'm glad I got it out there.
I'm glad you got it over with, exactly. Now to start the next one. Anyway, Chris' website is Chris BrennanAstrologer.com. That's his main site where you can get his courses as well as his newsletter and books and everything else that he's written and done. And also there is the Hellenistic Astrology.com, which is where you can also figure out the book and see what's going on there. And then finally, the astrologypodcast.com is his third website where you can also listen to his website, his blogs, as well as his podcast on astrology as well. So Chris, thanks so much for coming on today. It's been great talking to you, and it's always fun to hear new techniques, even if they are founded in the ancients. I certainly appreciate all the work you've done, and your love of astrology is admirable and shared by me as well. So thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure enough. Take care.
All right. Bye.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.turningofthewheel.com. That's www.turningofthewheel.com. Or you can call me at 978-393-1036. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.